and they're found in multiple texts, confirming each other. So what you say is correct. The possibility of misreading a text or imposing a meaning on a text is there, but I don't think that's the case here. Of course, that's my claim, but it's up to you to decide. Ultimately, you'd have to look into it. But I would say I have looked into it, and in terms of what I'm presenting, the kinds of information that I'm presenting, I'm pretty confident that the texts are being read properly. And it's part of the Vedic epistemology that there should be a system for maintaining the integrity of a text through time. And one way that you can check the integrity of the text is through the commentarial tradition, where they're analyzing the text word for word, and you can see that down through history, the same words have been preserved. But it is, epistemologically, it is a question. And in Bhagavad Gita, Krishna, who is ultimately the source of these texts, says, over the course of time, it is possible for the textual transmission to degrade. But he says, if that happens, I'll restore the text. And so the problem you raised is a real one. So I asked this gentleman to just wait and said he'd be next.
So in relation to the first question that was posed about the existence of past lives, so to classify a method as scientific, one of the criteria it should satisfy is a hypothesis is proposed and then it is validated against the existing data, the evidence. And then it also has to be reproducible. Now, if you look at the claim about past lives, it's not reproducible on every individual, though the texts which advocate past lives say that it's true for every living being. Now, what is the explanation that such evidence cannot be collected on every individual? Because if it's universal, then why it's not the case that some people may not remember?
I don't think that in every area of scientific research it has to be, as you say, that if a phenomenon takes place, it has to be represented in each individual. It can be reproducible in the sense that in more than one case, it can be verified. A report can be given and verified. That's reproducing a result. So it doesn't necessarily have to be in every case. Getting back to what I don't know if you were here in the very beginning. I was making a point about the Vedic epistemology, and I'm explaining my commitment to that epistemological system. Namely that there are different types of evidence. One type of evidence is pratyaksha, from what we can physically observe, perceive with our senses, measure, document. Then there is anumana, which means what we can logically infer from what we observed. The point that, according to the Vedic epistemology, is those methods are going to be imperfect because the senses are limited and the mind that we use for logical inference can be deceived, it can become the victim of cheating, it can become illusioned. So, according to the Vedic epistemology, the superior type of evidence is the Shabda Pramana, which means evidence that comes ultimately from the Supreme Conscious Being, who is the source of everything and knows everything, and is capable of communicating that knowledge. So, when I'm making these presentations in different circles, I'm very clear to myself and to others what my epistemological commitments are, namely that even though it's not a view shared by many people today in academic and scientific circles, this is my commitment. To me, the Shabda Pramana is evidence that I accept. And from the Shabda Pramana, there's evidence that reincarnation is a reality for everyone, and I accept that. So that's my fundamental epistemological commitment. Now, in trying to communicate ideas like that to others who do not have the same epistemological commitments, then, and who are putting most of their faith in pratyaksha and anumana, then whatever I can gather from pratyaksha and anumana that I can use that's consistent with what the Shabda Pramana says, I will use. But I'm not pretending either to myself or to anyone else that I'm relying solely on that. So, even if I couldn't find any evidence from any aspect of science, either from psychology or psychiatry or anything, I would still maintain my conviction that reincarnation is a fact, but if I didn't have anything to say to anyone based on pratyaksha and anumana, I'd just be quiet about it. So, in terms of everybody having, I think if we carefully looked at everybody, then I think we could find something in their consciousness that would be suggestive of past life. For example, some talent or ability that many children sometimes display unusual abilities in music or mathematics or something. Or people may in dreams encounter images of people and places they've never encountered before, or people will have a sensation of having been somewhere or something. But some people have been able to have recovered detailed memories of past lives, and that to me is interesting. I wouldn't expect everybody to have those memories because even according to the Shabda Pramana, generally we forget. So according to the Shabda Pramana, it's a special ability called Jata Smara that a few people have. They can remember a past life. So from my standpoint, I wouldn't expect everybody to have it. I would expect those who are Jata Smara, who have the ability to remember a past life, to do it. but I don't know if any of that's making sense.
Yeah,
To
so
you.
this ties into the broader question of is science in its current definition in and of itself enough to explain the truth? Because I think the subject of human inquiry is to try to get closer to the truth.
Yeah.
And if the science in its current definition cannot accommodate that, then do you think that, I mean, because oftentimes we encounter this question that if some hypothesis is really incomprehensible based on the anumana and pratyaksha as you described, then it's quite easily classified as pseudoscience. Now, my understanding is that the concept of pseudoscience, I mean, it's really vague because first of all, the scientific method is defined. I mean, it's not complete to get closer to the truth. So, what are your comments? I would like to.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot depends on the fundamental assumptions that we make. Metaphysical assumptions, really. If we assume that the only thing that really exists is matter, material elements, if you start with that fundamental assumption and you rule out non-material substance a priori, which many people think is necessary in science. If you rule out the influence of any kind of intelligence, and you rule out non-material substance, then the explanations that you can give are going to be constrained. And you're going to, any explanations that involve non-material substance or the action of some higher intelligence in producing some of the order and complexity that we observe are going to be rejected. Not because they're not true, but because methodologically they're considered. Of course, sometimes one conflates one's methodology with what really exists, and that's like a problem. So there's an interesting book published a couple of years ago by a philosopher who happens to be an atheist and pretty much a materialist, Thomas Nagel, called Mind and Cosmos. And he was pointing out this dilemma. The subtitle of the book was Why the Materialist Neo-Darwinian Explanation of Nature is Most Probably Wrong. He was pointing out that if you stick to the assumption that matter is the only thing that really exists and there's no intelligence operating on it, then you wind up having to admit that you don't have any really good explanation for how the first living things came into existence. You can speculate about it and be convinced that somehow or other molecules somehow form some first self-reproducing system. He says there's no generally accepted scientific explanation of that, even after so many decades of research and attempts. Neither are there any really complete, detailed explanations of how once you have such a first self-reproducing organism, you get all the complex biological forms we have today. there are claims to have bits and pieces of the puzzle, but there aren't any really detailed molecule by molecule explanations of how all this biological complexity comes about. Neither is there any really good explanation for consciousness, how it comes about. And once you have consciousness, how you get ethics and morality and all of this stuff. So I thought it was an interesting admission coming from an atheist and materialist. And his solution was somehow or other to attribute some level of consciousness to matter on a fundamental level, at the atomic level. He said you could solve the problem by soul and God, but he just said, I'm not inclined to do that, whereas I am. So I think what it points out is we have to be aware of the metaphysical assumptions that we are making. You know, when we start making judgments like that. If we look at the actual history of science, we can see that what's been called science has been carried out under a variety of metaphysical assumptions about the nature of reality. Currently, there isn't any metaphysical pluralism in science. Somehow or other, it's become understood. And it's interesting to figure out why it's become like that science can only be carried out under a set of rather strict materialist metaphysical assumptions about the nature of reality. And that, of course, limits the kinds of scientific explanations that can be offered. At the time of Darwin, there was a kind of metaphysical pluralism in science. And I think we're moving into a period in which it may become necessary to reintroduce a kind of metaphysical pluralism in science. And I think that book by Nagel was one sign of it. I think the work of the intelligent design theorist is another sign of it. Of course, they are not very popular. I think Nagel even got in a lot of trouble by saying in his book, even though he's an atheist, I don't think that these people should be treated the way they are. They're pointing out genuine problems in today's scientific understanding of life and the universe. And he has come under some very heavy criticism for saying that, atheist though he is. Now, if you go back to the time of Darwin, we find Darwin was operating according to a strict materialist metaphysics. But some of his contemporaries in British and European science were operating according to other kinds of metaphysical commitments. Like Richard Owen was a prominent biologist, one of his main interlocutors. He was operating according to a Platonist metaphysics, where you have, where he accepted the idea that there were sort of Platonic vertebrate forms existing on some higher level of reality that got reflected into the world of matter in different ways. There were other British scientists who were operating according to Judeo-Christian metaphysics. Yeah, they were Christian creationists, but they were in the universities at that time and actually had a dominant position. And they were promoting something called special creation. And that was one of the ideas that Darwin was operating against. And he said, I used to have that commitment myself. And even though it's held by most of the naturalists and biologists in British universities today, I'm going to propose something different. There were European biologists who were operating according to vitalist metaphysical assumptions, the idea that there were different subtle energies associated with biological organisms that influence their form and development. So there was a kind of metaphysical pluralism in science, and they were communicating with each other. They were finding a way to conduct scientific research from a variety of metaphysical positions. But by the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, that metaphysical pluralism vanished. And a very, you could say, almost totalitarian imposition of a very strict materialist metaphysics became dominant. But as I said, there are signs today of the need for a reintroduction of metaphysical pluralism into the world of science. I don't know if that
Yeah.
reflects on the point you're raising or not.
May-
Okay, who hasn't spoken yet? Okay, you haven't had a chance yet?
Yeah, so I had a couple of questions. I guess I can ask the first one. What do you think about the genetic evidence? Because that seems pretty conclusive that the origin of all modern humans is in Africa. I can give two examples, like the highest diversity of human populations is in the African populations, which is what you would expect for the oldest populations. And secondly, you might also look at, say, the Genographic Project or the data being collected by companies like 23andMe, where they just take your cheek sample and based on Y chromosome or mitochondrial DNA markers, they can identify the exact, not the exact, but the approximate path of migrations taken by our ancestors out of Africa. Also, there's some linguistic, historical linguistic evidence that Merritt Rulon and Greenberg here at Stanford have done on how language trees are similar to those phylogenetic trees of human populations.
Mm-hmm.
So, taking all that into account, doesn't that reinforce the mainstream account of human origins given by the archaeologists? Since there should be a single human story, but you know, the different kinds of data should be pointing to that same story.
Okay. You have to look at all the genetic studies because, as I noted in my book, Human Devolution, there are some genetic studies of that type that put an origin in Central Asia. You know, I mean, you can find, you know, studies that do that. But there's a larger problem with that, and it's that such studies are based on current, you know, human variation. Like, but they're not taking into account, especially most of the studies have been done with mitochondrial DNA.
There's also Y chromosome. Recently, a lot of
Yes.
work has been on the
Y chromosome and X chromosome. And, you know, some studies I've seen have shown you get different results from different sources, mitochondrial, X, Y. And then the other problem is that, do they adequately take into account the lines that have gone extinct in the past? And in terms of timing, see, the timing is also important, but that's based on there's all kinds of assumptions built into that about rates of mutation and divergence points that are based on assuming, say, humans diverged, you know, the earliest ancestors of humans diverged from chimpanzees 6 or 7 million years ago. those assumptions are built into the calculations,
Yeah,
as
I
far
think,
as I can see.
well, it depends on the kind of data you look at. So I did some work using microsatellite data,
Yeah,
and we didn't make any assumptions about, whether humans descended from chimpanzees or not. We're just looking at native populations around the world.
okay,
And what we found was, we actually did simulations as well as statistical analysis. And what we
Okay.
found was, if you pick an African origin, anywhere in Africa for that matter, you get a linear decrease in genetic diversity with increasing distance from Africa. And that is exactly what the data, the real data from native populations shows. So for that, we have to assume a certain mutation rate for microsatellites, but you don't have to
Yeah.
assume that humans are, humans and chimpanzees share a common ancestor. Although there has been separate work on that, which has
Right.
been done by geneticists. And
And
again, the
ours
timelines for those end up matching the archaeological timelines of 5 to 8 million years ago for the divergence.
Like they assume a branching pattern. Am I correct?
So I think what they assume is if they're looking at neutral markers, what we call as single nucleotide polymorphisms and microsatellites, which don't have a functional role. So those neutral regions of the genome accumulate mutations at a steady rate, regardless of.
So the rate has to be assumed,
Yeah, so that has
and
been.
it didn't change at any point.
Well, even if it did, for example, single nucleotide polymorphisms are a very different kind of region from microsatellites. So even if the rate for microsatellites changed, it would be very difficult for the rate for SNPs or single nucleotide polymorphisms, the mutation rates for those to change in a way that the conclusions are the same from both independent kinds of data. And so similarly, there's, the Y chromosome and the mitochondrial data it's like completely orthogonal to that. So is there any reconciliation that you have done on the genetic
Well,
evidence?
it's like, I've been reading some studies, and again, this, it's like controversial. It's like the question, say, humans are assumed to be genetically different from their predecessors. Is that right? In other words, there are genes have to come into play that did not exist before.
As far as inferring history is concerned, they don't really look at genes because genes have a functional role, and so
Yeah,
since
they
they
have
are
a
the
functional
influence-
role. In other words, to be a human, you have to be able to function in a certain way. And those functions have a genetic basis, is that correct?
Yeah, and those functional regions don't change in the same way that neutral regions of the genome
Right.
change, which don't have any function, because those would accumulate mutations steadily without harming the individual or the.
Right.
Whereas functional regions, being subject to natural selection, would not change at the same rate. They might actually be very well preserved for a very long time.
Okay, so your point is that the neutral regions, they accumulate mutations at a certain rate.
Yeah. And so the longer the population, the more those mutations have time to accumulate. And so the longer the
If-
population, the more the diversity of.
If there's not lines that have not reproduced.
We could take it up offline if you wish.
Huh?
I'm not sure
Well, are we getting a complete, from what's there today, is there a complete record of all the accumulation, or just all the accumulation. You're saying if there's more mutations that have accumulated at these neutral sites, that means longer periods of time.
Yeah, because if the populations have been living there for a short period of time, that wouldn't be enough time for mutations to accumulate from a single ancestor.
But what if some lines go, in other words, like there's some humans today who aren't going to have children. So their contribution isn't going to be
Yeah, so
in some future population.
Yeah, so the inference, strictly speaking, is that all humans that are living today are descended from a common ancestor who lived in Africa somewhere around 100,000 years ago, 50 to 100,000 years ago, according to Richard Klein here at Stanford. And there is some contribution from Neanderthals and Homo erectus that they say they debate about that, but in terms of the archaeological record, they see it as consistent with the mainstream
I see
account.
it as the archaeological record is not consistent with that particular view.
It is consistent because what the
How?
populations living prior to
Okay, if I have evidence that humans like us were existing 50 million years ago, how is that consistent with that finding?
Yeah, so I think 12 years back when I took Richard Klein's course, I was also reading your book at that time.
Yeah.
And I was looking, I was kind of asking people about that, and one of the replies I got was that the accounts that we have relied in your book, according to them, those accounts are from the 19th century, and if you look at the state of archaeology in that time, the accuracy of the reports, the methods that they used to document the excavations, those were not developed enough that we could rely on, we could give them the same status as, say, the excavations that are done today. So for example, the account of miners that you mentioned in the 19th century wouldn't have the same status as
According to them. But if, I think you have to look at the reports and then make a judgment. You can't make a general statement like that scientific evidence has an expiration date. Because what happens to the evidence that you're accumulating today? If just automatically in 200 years things will have progressed so much, then what's the status of your work? I don't think scientific evidence has an expiration date that automatically, once 100 years passes, then what happens to your research in 100 years?
I mean, one example that I saw.
So I think you have to look at each individual case. You can't make a blanket statement that, what about Mendel's research? It was done in, the 19th century. Or there are fossil discoveries that were made in the 19th century and they're still in textbooks today. You can't be, what I find is there's selective application of this age bias. Something that goes along with the dominant ideas is considered pioneering research, a great advance. Whereas if it goes against what's now dominant, it's old, can't be trusted. But I don't think that scientific work has an expiration date, like a bottle of milk, after the expiration date it suddenly becomes. But it's, in my book, Human Devolution, in chapter 4, I dealt with the genetic issues as I understood them at the time I was writing this book, which was admittedly a few years ago. So I looked at, the evidence that was there at that time and drew certain conclusions. I'm willing to look, if I have the time, because I'm involved in a lot of different things, to have a look at, the evidence as you're reporting it today and see if it influences my opinions in any way. Have you looked at this book?
I did read some sections.
Did you read the section on chapter 4 on the genetic evidence?
I don't recall. I recall reading Richard Thompson's book called God and Science, where he has a chapter on the genetic evidence, but that was written in the early 90s. And most of this research has been done only in the last 10 years.
Yeah, so in this book, I looked at the kinds of evidence that were being adduced at the time when, I was writing this book. And like I said, I'm willing to look again at what's been done since this time. This was written in the early 2000s, so now it's 10 years later.
I can correspond with you in
Okay,
discussing more.
I'd welcome that. But if you do have a chance to look at
I will look
at
at
this.
chapter 4.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah, then we could, whatever you want to draw my attention to, I'll look at.
Yeah, I think our goals are similar. It's just that I
Yeah.
haven't been able to find that reconciliation that you have.
And then there's some other things I'll also try to draw your attention to. Not the specific genetic things that you're talking about, but other things that relate to human origins. Okay.